just to warm us up, Francis Pryor, who's ex-president of the CBA, fronted Time Team enormously successfully for many years, has written a huge number of very successful books, and it's horrible to sit next to him because he just takes the piss out of you all the time. And just a question for all of you, very briefly, I don't need more than 3 or 4 sentences. What do you think Mick's legacy is to archaeology and communication generally? And do you think in 10, 15 years' time, a show like Time Team will look really old-fashioned?
And the short answer to that is, what? Do I need this? Yeah. Mick made archaeology human. Before that, people had preached archaeology from a great height and they'd condescended. Mick made it human. And will it be around in 15 years' time? Yes, because he's given it to the people, and it's the people who will make it happen.
Julian Richards.
Well, thank you, Francis, for putting that so succinctly. I don't know how I'm supposed to follow that. I was just looking around and thinking, what about the combined age of the people on this panel? Right. Oh yes. Sorry. Oh yes. You mustn't do that to a lady, must you? I'd agree with that, Francis. That sense of making it accessible to people, making people feel that they can be a part of it, and that it is a shared past that's shared by all of us, everybody in this country and beyond, and that we can help to appreciate it, to investigate it, and that investigation itself is exciting, but makes you value it more. And I think that's the thing, making us value the past.
Stuart Ainsworth. Stuart, you're a landscape archaeologist. He did really emphasise the notion of the landscape and context, didn't he?
He did. I'll try and keep my answer very, very short, really. I think Mick told very complicated stories, but he told them very simply, in a way that we could all understand. And in many ways, the landscape, every time I go out and look at the landscape, part of Mick goes with me. He opened my eyes into many aspects of landscape I wouldn't have understood without reading things Mick has written and watching things Mick broadcast on television.
John Gator.
Well, Mick, as you all know, studied the Dark Ages. He used to refer to geophys as a dark art. And I think if Time Team or its ilk were to come back in 15 years' time, it'd be fronted by dowsing.
Carenza Lewis.
Yeah, I suppose, not to repeat everybody else, I think one of the things Mick has helped pave the way to is actually show how archaeology doesn't need people to help it, although it does, but it also can help other people. It can actually make a difference to society, and you can do that in ways that nothing else can in many respects. So it doesn't have to be a supplicant, it's a really powerful tool for society.
Thanks. Phil, he wasn't just a colleague, he was one of your very best friends, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was my mate, and he was a damn good mate. But I mean, what everybody else has been saying about how he made simple things very simple, and he could explain and communicate to people. There was nobody better. But as we've already heard from so many of the speakers today, he was a damn good academic. He was a really good bloke, and he really did contribute some good archaeology. That's what made him special for me. Would Time Team last in 15 years? Well, yeah, like Julian says, probably most of us will be pushing up the daisies in then, so it ain't going to really make a muscle of difference whether we do or not. But techniques will change. They'll change, but at the end of the day, it will still be a matter of digging a hole with a pick and shovel, and that'll never change.
Mike Howarth is the boss of the CBA, the Council for British Archaeology. Well, boss isn't the right word. That's not on your director. That's it, yeah. And has been a friend of ours for a long, long time now. What was your feeling about Mick?
Well, the Council for British Archaeology's sort of mission statement is archaeology for all. And it seems to me that sums up Mick's approach. He wanted to involve everybody. And there was an opportunity for everybody to get in there, get their hands dirty, learn something, and enhance their lives through that. And Mick was a fantastic communicator. That lies at the heart of his real appeal. There will always be place for communicators. The media may change, the techniques may change, the science may change, we may change, but there'll always be places for communicators like Mick.
Good. Chris Gerard is the professor at Durham, and he was Mick's amanuensis, and I say that because I've always wanted to use that word.
Very impressive. Yeah, I think that one of the things I'd like to pick up on there is that Mick saw archaeology as a kind of therapy, almost, both actually for himself, in terms of his own job and in his university life, as a way of getting away from the humdrum of daily existence, meeting a group of like-minded people who were drawn together by a single goal, men and women working together without boundaries in that sense, towards a common objective over a period of time. And that kind of friendship is something which is, in a sense, very much a therapy, which I have always benefited from, and I guess we all would. And it's quite a rare thing to find today in this modern world, in a world in which we are so divided from each other, and perhaps too enthralled with digital technologies in the luxury of our own homes. So I think that's one of the things that Mick will be remembered for. Time Team, well, I think, I wasn't in Time Team, but I guess like many of you, I wish it had continued. I wish it was still continuing today, because when I look at my students and talk to them, I know that they were and are still influenced by Time Team, and that's why they got interested in the subject. And I really regret the loss of that promotion which Time Team has given us, and that exposure. I think archaeology has suffered from the lack of it.
And finally, Helen Geek.
It's always difficult to be last, isn't it? Because everybody's spoken so eloquently. But I want to give you a little window into my world in 1985 to illustrate the fact that Mick really did feel that archaeology was for everybody. When I went to the day schools and the training days out in the field that Mick organised in Bristol as a teenager, I suddenly wasn't a failed school leaver who was working as an office junior and living at home. I was suddenly an archaeologist. I may not have been an archaeologist for very long, and I may not have known what I was doing, but I was an archaeologist, and we were all working in pursuit of that common goal, me and the professors. I felt totally accepted in a world that I've been happy in ever since. So I'm one of those people that's been directly benefited and taken from the underachieving to the achieving by Mick. But the other thing, of course, that Mick was really good at making sure you didn't forget was that it's very easy in archaeology to be seduced by the patterns, that you've got houses that fit together along a road, or you've got pottery that does this on graphs, and you've got metalwork that does this, that, and the other, and art styles and so on. And he reminded you that there were always people behind it. And for all that Mick said he didn't like the privileged, he included people like archbishops of Canterbury and missionaries from Rome, as much as the lowliest unnamed person who was converted eventually in the 8th century or something. All these people, the person living in that house, the person wearing that buckle, the person drinking or eating out of that pottery, he always made sure you remembered that it was people, not things, that we were digging up.
That's lovely. I'm going to ask you for questions or indeed observations in a second, just to pick up on something that Helen had just said. Mick was actually intensely political. He was passionately political. He was never a member of a political party. Certainly, he wouldn't have joined the Labour Party while Tony Blair was in charge of it. He was virulently anti-Tony Blair, but he was absolutely committed to the notion that the thing he loved most, which was archaeology, should be for everybody. And he felt that it was an elite discipline, not that it needed to be, but that it was. I remember him saying to me very early, it's probably the only discipline which 99% of the country can't even spell, let alone get their heads around. And so much of it, the explanation for so much of it is written in such arcane language that it actually deliberately pushes people away rather than welcomes people towards it. And it was why he, like Hoskins before him, was so passionate about community archaeology. And when I look round this panel, virtually nobody, with the exception of Carenza, is a posh academic. No, I'm sorry. But no, seriously though, everybody here is committed to the notion of archaeology really being for the people, and even if you all had the seeds of that before you met Mick, I'm sure it was him watering those seeds which encouraged that passion to grow with him. And what you used to see on the telly and what you warmed to was the fierceness of his conviction. First question. There's a gentleman up there by the wall, and anybody in this half that we can get lined up? Not for the moment. Okay. Oh, is there? Yes, somebody there. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Hi. I recently completed the DigVentures online course, so I should be up on stage with you, by the way. And I'm disappointed you didn't invite me. But one of the topics that came up during the course was, with the increasing amount of digs going on, like DigVentures digs and all the archaeology that's going on, more and more material is being collected, and the place to archive it, display it, is running out. Would you folks care to talk about your feelings about what's going to happen with all this material that's being collected? What's going to happen to it? How is it going to get worked on?
Francis was grunting as you asked that question, so I'll ask him to ask it first. Given there are so many people on the panel, if you could limit yourself to just a couple of paragraphs.
Chapter 1. There is actually a very important point here, and that is the material coming out of the ground has to be stored and eventually has to be studied and displayed and so on. And that's not going to happen if local authorities pull out of archaeology. And that is what's happening. I live quite near the county of Northamptonshire, and the county has moved out of all museums. It's an absolute disgrace. There's no control over archaeology. Developers are encouraged to build anywhere. And I think we have got to get control back over local authorities. We need people to take more of an interest in their immediate surroundings. Yes, archaeology matters as a broad discipline, but it can only be influenced in your own neighborhood, your own surroundings. So if you don't know what the attitude of your local authority is to museums and archaeology, then find out and be political. We are going to have to get more political in this world. Archaeologists have got to get more political. We've got to get more involved, and we've got to stand up for the past because it's too important to be left to local politicians.
wanted to mention on Francis's point, the Council for British Archaeology just completed a very important bit of work called the Local Heritage Engagement Network. And on their website is a series of materials including letters and contact numbers and processes so that you can get in touch with your local politicians and help make the case for archaeology.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you for that, Lisa. What do I say now? I mean, Francis is a past president of CBA, and I absolutely endorse what he said. It's really, really important that everybody who has a passion for the past stands up and makes politicians aware of that. You know, resources are under huge pressure. We know that. Local authorities in England are supposed to be self-financing by 2020. They have to take tough decisions. But ultimately, they should be listening to you as to what you think are important. You will determine where the resources go. And if we want to ensure that people stand up and speak for archaeology, we need everybody in this room, online, everybody going and talking to their local politicians, their local councillors, their local MPs, making the case for why archaeology matters to you, and then the resources will flow. Without that, we've got few problems.
Just while we're talking CBA then, I'm a Vice Chair of the CBA and a trustee. I want to endorse what's said. The CBA is working with Historic England to look at this issue of curation and preservation and look at discard policy, ideas about what should be saved. But it is the case that too often when projects are started, people haven't thought through what to do about that storage at the end. It needs to be priced in at the beginning of a project. But if you don't belong to the CBA, please join it. Please do join it, because there are dwindling resources to carry out this activity. And if that case ceases to be made, then that voice will be lost. So if you don't belong to the Council for British Archaeology, whether you're sitting in this room or whether you're listening across the world, please do join it.
Can I just say something about local government? Well, while we're on the topic of local government, it is true that if you write to your local politicians, then you may be able to change their mind from funding the things that they statutorily have to fund, which they won't stop funding because they can't, or the things that they morally have a great deal of need to fund, like adult social care and so on. To try to skew that over to heritage is going to be a really difficult ask. And therefore, what we need to do is we need to accept that local governments cannot be self-financing, not when we have places like Cornwall and the Northwest and Great Yarmouth and so on that simply do not have enough money to be able to do the things that are necessary. So you need to write to your MPs, particularly if your MPs are in the government, and try to get them to change these ridiculous policies. Now, I have taken a leaf out of Mick and Tony's book, and I have become an actual politician. I've joined the Green Party, and my hobby is now standing for Parliament, which... Which leads me, I only do it because I enjoy it, but so I don't need the round of applause. But anyway, which leads me on to say that at a funeral relatively recently that wasn't actually Mick's, but another archaeologist, some of us were talking about how, I think someone had recently had grandchildren, and we were talking about how people die and people are born, and people have to die in a sense to make space for the people who are born. And then somebody said, that's like the historic environment, isn't it? We keep adding new sites and new finds and new excavations. We never get rid of any. And I thought, with my green hat on, I just ought to flag this up as a problem. It's like economic growth. It's ultimately unsustainable. We can't keep on scheduling more sites, listing more buildings forever and ever and ever and ever. I know that we only have really our own lifetimes that we're thinking about most of the time, or our children's or our grandchildren's. But actually, it's not going to go on forever. So we ought to do what we're interested in now, and I don't feel we ought to be leaving so much for posterity. You know, like as David was saying about Lindisfarne, why not dig what we're interested in now? Because who knows what may be coming in the future. But also to keep an eye on the sustainability of keeping everything. I don't know what the solution is. And ultimately, the last thing I'll say on politics is, also being an Anglo-Saxonist, you do kind of keep looking back to the end of the Roman Empire when people didn't want to pay their tax and they started to get potholes in their roads. And look where that ended. Do we really want to go through that again?
Gentleman over there.
So I think actually you've anticipated what I was going to ask about, which is upcoming threats and how the archaeological community is going to deal with Brexit and the post-Brexit environment. So I think having really covered that to some extent, let me ask a more easy question. What's the most exciting development in technology that's coming towards archaeology? And does things like genetics, is that been incorporated into the archaeology, or is that a separate field?
So what's important that's coming up in archaeology, if anybody wants to discuss the relationship between Brexit and archaeology, I leave that open to them. But John, let me ask you first about just about geophys, with a geophys.
I can't talk about Brexit then. I was all set. You can see they used me as a joker. When nobody else has got anything to say, they pass me the mic. I've got nothing to say.
No, seriously, about
Seriously,
geophys,
I really think the way forward is going to be the use of drones and actually precision farming, if I can speak. Basically, tractors are going out, they're driven by robotics, they're collecting data that help the farmers decide where to put more water, where to put more grain. What we need to do is attach a few detectors to those farmers, and the job is done for us. Buy a few drones, attach instruments to those, fly over the sites. Geophysicists will be out of business. I'm quite happy, because I'll be gone.
Stu, have you got any thoughts?
Well, yeah, tomorrow I'm going to be talking a little bit about how we use LiDAR in archaeology and some of the help it gives us to understand features in the landscape. But I also want to highlight the use of remote sensing and LiDAR for one area of archaeology which I don't think we've explored much or will explore much over the weekend. And that's using technology to use archaeology interface with the natural environment, how we can use archaeology to understand pollution from lead and zinc sources, particularly in areas like the North Pennines, the Mendips, the Yorkshire Dales. And there are many, many ways which you can use archaeological techniques, such as LiDAR, geophysics, ground-penetrating radar, chemical sampling of soils, and so on. And we need to start thinking not so much about just finding artifacts of the past. It's finding artifacts of the past which help us shape the future, how we understand pollution. And I think projects which breach both archaeology and the natural environment, I think is the way forward. For instance, one site that I did some work on a few years ago, where we were able to identify very historic lead mining pollution from sites which are not on the record at all, and did this work with the Environment Agency. This is fine particle waste, which was broken up back in the medieval period and has sat on the surface ever since. It absorbs zinc and lead pollution like a sponge, and then when you get rainfall and snow melt, it goes down through the fluvial channels and it ends up in you. So identifying where these historic lead mining sites were can help agencies plan for pollution and stop that getting into the ecosystem. So I think technology can be used that we've got now and actually used more creatively.
I'll take Julian first, because he hasn't said anything yet.
Thank you. We've been reminded already that archaeology is about people rather than the objects that they used and buried. And of course, over the last couple of decades, the greatest advances, as far as I'm concerned, have been in isotope studies, DNA studies, and things like that. Because what these have done is they've shown us how people move. And and people and animals have moved around not only between countries but in our country. That's extraordinary. I think this is changing our whole perception of the past. I think that developments in these techniques, and particularly in making them more available, because at the moment they're still expensive, they're applied not universally to everything that's dug up. I think that's going to be an enormous advance in our understanding of the past. The only thing that slightly worries me is that sometimes the results of these, they can be slightly ambiguous, and sometimes there's an agenda behind what people want to say from these results. And I've looked at some of the recent studies that have come out and thought, really, I'm not 100% convinced that you're interpreting the evidence in the right way. But I think the advances in this science and the fact that it is available to people to make their own judgments about is actually incredibly important. So that to me are going to be the greatest advances soon.
Chris.
Thanks. Can I talk about Brexit? How long have we got? It's quite interesting, actually, the potential impact on archaeology, I think. I mean, I work in a university which about 30% of its money comes from EU projects and grants. 30%. We have large numbers of foreign students, both at undergraduate and postgraduate level, who, until now, have been freely able to come and go. We have about 25% of the staff are European, or their origins are abroad and may have difficulties in the future in terms of visas and so on. So what exactly is going to happen? And my prediction for this, I think, is that archaeologists are pretty fleet-footed and quite flexible, and they will begin to look into other possibilities for funding. And one of them that Stuart has already raised is the natural environment. And I think to make archaeology as relevant as we possibly can to other areas of ologies and ographies in other departments. We need to be doing the kind of work that Stuart's talking about. I do a project, for example, on earthquakes and archaeology, and that's something that's attracted a great deal of interest. It's another way of me doing the archaeology that I want to do, but I'm feeding it through another set of grant applications and other groups of people to enable me to do the archaeology that I want. And I can see that greater flexibility and urgency is something that will have to come to us all if we're going to be able to continue to put together the big projects that we want to do, certainly at a university level.
Phil, you just said that you want to.
Yeah, I mean, listening to what people have been saying, particularly about the Brexit job and all the rest of it, I mean, I know working in the commercial sector, just how much we rely on foreign nationals to help dig our archaeology. I mean, I don't quite know what the state of play is with the universities coming through and how many, with all due respect and all the rest of it, after they come out of university, they are not equipped necessarily to be archaeologists. They are just cracking the surface. As we all know, we might be knocking on a bit, but we do have the advantage of experience, and you can't replace experience. You can't necessarily teach experience. You gain experience. And certainly, I think, and I know I'm quite sure that a lot of the commercial units in this country are actually relying on foreign labour. And my God, we need them. They might be foreigners, but we need them. And I mean, we do. We have, I think we got about 20 or 30 different nationalities. They have a bit of problem with spelling sometimes. They can't spell archaeology, but never mind. They're good sorts. And my God, we'd be in a hole without them. We really would be. I don't know what's going to happen when we go, but there we go. I suppose we'll have to sort that out or leave it to the politicians. God help us.
And then there's someone over there.
I'll just say a couple of words about Brexit. Like Chris, I work at a university, has already been pointed out. Again, very reliant on foreign grant money and foreign students. But also, I live in an area, Lincolnshire, which has a huge need of European funding and also European labour. So I do think it's going to be a huge problem. And like a lot of people, I'm just praying that sometime sooner or later the grown-ups will come back into the room of politics and come to a bit of sense. But the other point I was going to make, actually going back to the question about technology and new techniques, perhaps just brighten up, I think pottery dating, actually. There's a lot of work being done using new techniques from physics to try and date more accurately any material that's been fired. It's working well on brick and tile, not so well on pottery yet, but I think we will get to a point where we will be able to date quickly and easily with a machine, as it were, not the date at which pottery was fired and the last date at which it absorbed any daylight, and we will know exactly when things were made and when they went into the ground. And perhaps everything I've been saying this afternoon will either be proved to be brilliantly prescient or completely wrong. But we will have all those sherds of pottery that we can then quickly pop them through that machine because we have kept them. So that's linking up all those points, really.
Young woman over there.
What advice would you give someone who aspires to be an archaeologist?
What advice would you give to someone who wants to be an archaeologist? I won't go through everybody, but I will start with Francis on that one.
I think my advice would be, don't study archaeology until you absolutely have to. Okay? My A-levels were botany, zoology, and geology. I didn't do archaeology at A-level, and the botany, zoology, and geology I did served me in very, very good stead. So if you're thinking of being an archaeologist, get something under your belt that you can use as an archaeologist, like some science. That would be very useful. An understanding of statistics, that sort of thing. But don't study archaeology too early. Put it off as long as you possibly can.
I'll ask Julian and I'll ask Phil.
I think be curious, ask lots of questions. Question everything, especially archaeologists. If you've been down to the trench, it will say there's a big banner there saying, ask the archaeologists anything, and see if they can answer. But I would heartily endorse what Francis said. I came into it quite late, and accidentally, actually, which you may regard as a benefit for archaeology or not. But have a wide range of interests. Communicate, hone your skills, listening, talking, writing, those sort of things. The way of communicating information are actually very important as well. And yes, enjoy it.
You
won't end up like Phil.
I was just thinking. What I would say is take a leaf out of my book. When I started to be an archaeologist, or when I wanted to be an archaeologist, everybody told me I couldn't be. And the only person who ever told me that I might have a chance was a bloke in a labour exchange. Now, there are probably some people here, quite a lot of people, who are old enough to remember a labour exchange. And I said I wanted to be an archaeologist, and he said, I don't know how you can be an archaeologist. He said, the only advice I can give to you is go and do it. He said, go and do it to the best of your ability for as long as you can, and keep doing it as long as you can. And if you have to give up, say, well, at least I tried. All I can say is, I am still trying.
Just before Mike speaks, is there anybody else who'd like to ask a question? Oh, that's good. We're warming up now. Lady just behind you.
I was just going to build on what Phil said in terms of taking part, getting your hands dirty, giving it a try. One of the best ways to do that is through the Young Archaeologist Club, which the CBA runs. There are something like 70 branches all across the UK, run by volunteers. They often have monthly meetings. It's a fantastic way to get involved in archaeology. Don't specialise too soon, as Francis says. Get that broad experience, and then see what particular aspects might turn you on, and then pursue your dreams.
Yes.
Well, first of all, here's sort of a little bit of a light question. I want to throw it out there. Always talk about Brexit, and we being from the United States having our own issues. And so, a little bit. So first I want to just say that I first started watching Time Team on YouTube 5 years ago. And I think I caught up with 20 years worth of episodes in about a week. And I have to say that as interesting as archaeology is, and I find it, there's no way I could have done that in 1 week if it hadn't been for, you say archaeology, Mick said archaeology is about people, and it was so much about the people up on the stage. You were just so much fun to watch. You just made it fun. And when I told my friends I was coming to the Holy Island of Lindisfarne for an archaeology festival, they looked at me like, what? And I said, because you don't understand, these people are amazing. And so I want to thank you for that. And with that said, I'd love to get an idea from you. One particular find or one or two finds you've had that just made you, that just jazzed you. You thought this is the best thing I've ever found, and what that was.
Most of the people on stage won't understand what you meant by that, but but as I have some vaguely American shirt on, I was once asked. We were at Turkdean in Gloucestershire, and we had a mosaic floor specialist with us, and we were sitting there over lunch one day, and he said to me, I reckon there is a Roman tessellated pavement just beneath our feet. He said, I don't think it's very deep. And he passed me a trowel and said, do you want to see if there is? And I said, but I'm not an archaeologist. I'm someone who pretends to be. My skills are entirely different. He said, don't worry about that. He said, you won't mess it up. The whole thing about a floor is that by definition it's robust. A floor that wouldn't survive. I'll be over your shoulder, just have a little excavation. And I started to excavate, and really only after about 60 seconds, I saw one little square, a little white square, and then another, and then another, and then a coloured one, and then a different coloured one, and I knew I'd got a pattern. And I could only do it for about 20 minutes or so because I had to go away and shoot at another trench. But I uncovered about that much of a Roman floor which nobody else had seen for about 16 or 1700 years. And it was one of the great moments of my life.
I think this sense that objects can tell stories is so important. First dig that I was on, I was given a big medieval pit to dig, and I thought this was a big treat. And as it got deeper, the soil got rather green at the bottom. And it was a cesspit. It was a medieval cesspit, though, but at the bottom of it was a bronze key, a big bronze door key. And I remember sitting in the bottom of this cesspit, holding this bronze key and thinking, how did it get here? And I've got that sort of imagination. I imagined the bloke who'd lived in the big house next to it coming back late one night from the trip to Jerusalem, Nottingham, oldest pub in England, going for a pee and suddenly hearing a splash and thinking, bugger, there goes the door key. I'm going to have to knock the servants up. Yeah, that's obviously ridiculous, but it made me realise that objects could tell stories. And that you were contacting people. So that, to me, that bronze key in the cesspit has stuck with me for the rest of my life.
Anybody else?
But this may sound very strange, but the favourite thing I think we found on Time Team for me was barbed wire.
Oh, yeah.
This was at Llanadwy in Wales, and some of you obviously have seen that programme. But the whole programme, in a way, became a marvellous example of how archaeologists think, and examining the evidence, even if it's only 20 years old, and following it through to its logical conclusion, was a very exciting thing to be involved in, even though we didn't find any real archaeology. We were talking about this earlier, weren't we, Francis? And one of the sound crew who'd worked with us for years and years and years on Time Team, a guy called Steve Bowden, said after the barbed wire, which was under, for those that didn't watch the programme, the barbed wire was underneath an Iron Age sword, which isn't right. And Steve Bowden said after that sequence was filmed, he says, I've been with this lot now for, I don't know, 10 years or something. This is the first time I've ever understood what stratigraphy means.
I think I'll pick one of lots of possibles, but there's, again, a mosaic, actually, from Cirencester. I was talking earlier to a few of you about this, and that was, again, we found it in a back garden. It is a lovely feeling uncovering those sorts of features. They do. And then we saw the small tesserae, and then we saw there was huge, great big chunks, slabs of stone and reused tile, big lumps of it. And as we uncovered the whole thing, we could see that this mosaic had clearly been repaired. And by the time we got the whole of it out, we could see that actually the repair had been quite good. It was perfectly level. But the stone and the tile and stuff actually was, again, there was bits of white stone, bits of darker stone, bits of red tile. And this attempt had been made in this really crude repair to follow the red and black and white pattern of the original beautifully detailed mosaic. And I think that really summed up somehow that, they grandparents probably are the people who repaired the mosaic, had paid for this beautiful mosaic to be made, and as the end of the Roman Empire hove in sight, people don't know what's coming, but the tide is turning, and they haven't got the resources to mend the mosaic. It starts to get a hole in it. You could imagine the arguments about when are you going to repair the hole in the mosaic. And then eventually, all right, okay, I'll do something about the mosaic. But they don't, the specialists are there's no longer enough money in the economy to have the specialists to do that. So they're just shoving something in the hole. But actually, there's that kind of pathetic attempt to keep up standards as the tide of history is turning. And I think that speaks so much to human experience. You're just always trying to do your best. And that tiny mute moment from the past, again, putting the people back in the past.
Can I have a go?
John, you wouldn't know an archaeological find if you ever saw
But it's very difficult to top that from Carenza. But there's something that I describe to people as the time team effect, which is that every so often you have to stop because somebody's doing some filming or somebody's not doing some filming. You're ready for something to be filmed and you have to wait, or you have to wait for somebody to finish something else. And there are two examples of this that have led to fantastic discoveries. The first one was at Isha, where we were looking at a brick-built building with these extraordinary glazed bricks. And we had the Minters from Bulmer Brick and Tile Company, who make the best ever heritage bricks, to come and do the experimental archaeology. Remember those? Well, we never really thought. I mean, I always thought they were a bit of fun. We weren't going to make massive discoveries. Well, the Minters had been trying to reproduce these glazed bricks for years. I think they'd done thousands of experimental firings, and they'd never managed to work out how to make these bricks. But because they needed to film, they made 4 or 5 different stages. And they were hanging about with these green bricks. What are we going to do? It's a bit boring here, waiting for the people to come back and film things. We had all these bricks, and so they thought, well, we'll just mess about. We'll dip this. We know that they didn't put a green brick in the glaze, so we'll just mess about and do that. And it turned out that is exactly what they did. And if they hadn't been doing a time team cameo with all this hanging about, they'd never have tried it. And that sorted out the problem of how 15th and 16th century brickmakers made glazed bricks. So that's the first one. The second one is very familiar to Teresa. Teresa and I were standing on the edge of a trench watching some interminable filming on the Isle of Mull when Teresa said, "What's that over there?" And I said, what do you mean? What that stone? Well, there's a lot of stone there, Teresa. What are you talking about? No, she said, that one with the kind of grid pattern on it. And I said, what, you mean the one that looks like a bar of chocolate? I said, yes, that's not natural, is it? And Teresa said, well, I thought it looked a bit odd. And I asked Tracy, and she said, I trod on it with my boot, and it's just my boot patterning. But we were standing there looking at it for so long that in the end, Teresa said, I'm going to go over. As soon as they finish, I'm going to go over and have a look. And somebody shouted, cut, and Teresa nipped over, and it was a new piece of stone sculpture, wasn't it? A new piece of And it was rather like the St Cuthbert cross, but made out of stone. And it was just, we wouldn't have noticed it if there hadn't been all the hanging about.
We think it was actually a marker for a saint, don't we? That's
And it's something, when it all comes back to me at the thing, you know, I probably found more stuff than this lot put together because I did more digging than most of them. And now I'm asked to pick out my best find. And we've already had the best one. The barbed wire is win hands down in my book. Mick loved that. And he liked for the purposes. And the boot mark, we discussed that yesterday. It's always a favourite. If I have to pick out another one of my own, sadly, it has to be a Saxon find. Here's me a confirmed prehistorian. But I remember when we did that Saxon cemetery in, where was it, Northamptonshire somewhere, and we found that equal arm brooch. Oh my God, that was a beautiful object.
Can you explain what it was?
It was like a massive Roman number 1. Well, like an H, like a letter H laid on its side, if you know what I mean. Does that make sense? Thank you. Either you're nodding off or you're going to sleep or something, or you're agreeing. Anyway, I'd only ever seen one of those before, and that was back in 1975, and it was in the village next door to where I was living, and here I was up in the Midlands finding another one. And I always remember having the discipline, even if I do pat myself on the back, the discipline not to dig it up, because I realised that this was a major piece of skilled excavation that was going to do it. And we block lifted it, didn't we? Took it back to Wessex. Of course, Telly wanted to see this thing. Well, can you go and expose a bit more of it? I said, no, I ain't going to do that. Because the more you expose it, the more it would deteriorate, the more it would fall to bits. And Time Team came down to Wessex Archaeology, and they excavated it. We filmed it being excavated. It was one of the most wonderful pieces of artifact conservation I have ever seen. An absolute dream piece of work by our conservator down there. I used to love going down to Lynn. Got that equal arm brooch, and she'd love getting it out of the case. It was the most beautiful object, and the way she put it back together again. And like I say, there was, for me, that wonderful link with people living up in the Midlands with somebody that I was familiar with living in a village next door to where I was. And just that link between the two was just something which is very personal to me. To hell with the telly, it was personal to me.
Well, Phil may have dug more than anyone else, but I think I can claim to have found more sites than anyone else.
Found more football pitches too.
You wait until tomorrow. I just want to mention 2 sites. The first was down in Cornwall. There was a fogu, an underground chamber, sort of Iron Age in date, I believe, so they say. And fogus are usually associated with a curving ditch. We did a survey on a small lawn, and we found a curving ditch. Fantastic. But we only had time to do a resistance survey. We didn't have time to do a magnetic survey. Got quite excited. We dug a trench over the curving ditch, which turned out to be a curving iron pipe. How many curving iron pipes do you get? Then one which, for me, was probably the most exciting was at Tyler Hill in Canterbury, one of the live shoots, and we were looking for a medieval tile kiln on a hill called Tyler Hill. And we went over with the magnetometer, and we got some really nice responses. In fact, it was one of the first time I'd seen a classic anomaly that's associated with a kiln, where you get a double peak because it sees first one wall, you walk over the middle, and then you see the second wall. And I just knew it had to be one of the kilns. We then did some radar, and I couldn't believe the results, because it said to me the kiln was intact. Now, nobody believes me, whatever I say. And so I didn't want to say too much about having found the kiln and to say it was intact. But within the hour, we'd stripped the surface off. Krenza was there, and she put a camera down through a hole in the ground and revealed a totally intact medieval tile kiln. And that, for me, was a victory.
Francis, if you can be very quick, we've just had a 5-minute extension, so you give your answer, then I'll ask for one more question. Who else wants to ask a question? Have we got a lady down the front there? And then that'll be it.
Right, I'll be very quick. It isn't an object at all, because quite often archaeologists get excited about things that aren't objects. And I was put in mind of this one by something Julian said about the green slime and cess. Now, normally, on an archaeological site, the cess smells of nothing because it's medieval and bacteria have got to work on it and it won't smell. But on one of the time teams, we were excavating a navvy camp high on Ribblesdale in the Yorkshire Dales, over 1,000 feet up. And we knew that the navvy huts had to have had a latrine because they didn't have one in the navvy huts. So this was constructed between about 1871 and 1877, when they were actually building the Settle Carlisle Railway. Anyhow, we found the site of the latrine, which is slightly downhill from the camp, as you'd expect. But we also knew from the census of 1871 that a man had cut his wrists when he sat in the latrine. So I was digging with Rackshire, and we were scraping away at this cess. And it was the most eerie experience because the cess smelled. Now, you may say, oh, poo, you know. No, I have never smelled the past before. It was the most extraordinary thing. And it smelled of, you know, what you'd expect, but smelled very strongly. And as we went down, it suddenly occurred to me, my God, this is what that unfortunate man was smelling as lifeblood was flowing out through his arms. And I've never forgotten it. It haunts me to this day.
Is there anything in particular that Mick said that really has stayed with you over the years, serious or not?
Is there anything that Mick has said that has stayed with us? Anything that he's done that stayed with us? Just anything about Mick that has stayed with you? Oh, it's the missus.
Whenever I had problems with something and I was up against somebody or some situation like that, he used to say to me, just say to them, piss off, bandy legs.
Anyone want to have a crack at that one? Something about Mick that has remained with you?
We often used to have dinner of an evening after time team. I say often because Phil and I often used to stay in the pub and miss dinner. But when we were sat at the table all together, Mick would always make a toast. And that has stuck with me. And I think most people know what I was saying. And it was death to our enemies.
On that note, ladies and gentlemen, we wish you a very good night and hope to see you tomorrow.